So Patrick and I are going to do a little Dharma sharing around the topic of wise speech. And, sometimes that's also called right speech, or I love Thich Nhat Hanh refers to it as loving speech, which very much resonates for me. So we'll be just talking a little bit about what this practice of wise speech is about, how we are living it in our own lives, and particularly through a queer lens. What does this mean for us as queer folks to engage in wise speech or loving speech with each other in our lives? So Patrick, I'm going to invite you to just kick us off.
Right,
a little bit about what is this wise speech about?
Thanks, Renee. Also, like queering the Dharma, it's kind of powerful. It's like a whole thing, a whole practice, and I love that it's our kind of thread and theme. So I'm reading just a little bit from The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching, which is a Thich Nhat Hanh book, recently passed, and I can't think of anybody who hasn't been touched by Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, either personally or through the amplification of other people's teachings. So if folks are familiar with the Eightfold Path, I often start a talk by why do we practice? Are you practicing to awaken in this lifetime? And if not, then what is the quality that you're trying to build? And I often, when I ask students that question, it's I want to reduce my suffering. I mentioned that I come through the doorway of suffering to the Dharma. Many people do. And so how do we get there? How do we reduce our suffering? These Four Noble Truths really guide us on the path, right? There's this suffering for all beings. There's the end of suffering. There's a cause to the suffering. There's this pathway that we can follow. And the pathway, we talk about the Eightfold Path, and it has components, just guideposts that can be here are some things you can do, qualities to generate, practices to enjoy, that will help purify and bring you towards more wholesome experiences. And so right speech or loving speech falls on that journey of the Eightfold Path. So the idea is that if you can reduce suffering by bringing intention to your speech, that certain types of speech will reduce your suffering and your experience. So imagine combing through your day's emails and the communications with your loved ones and even what you post online and saying can you meet this criteria? So here Thich Nhat Hanh says, of the four, there are four pieces to wise speech. One is speaking truthfully. When something is green, we say it is green and not purple. So you're honest. The second is we do not speak with a forked tongue. We don't say one thing to one person and something different to another. Right? So this idea of do we cultivate people's responses by how and what we share and how we share it. Number three, not speaking cruelly. We don't shout, slander, curse, encourage suffering, or create hatred. Even those who have a good heart and don't want to hurt others sometimes allow toxic words to escape from their lips, and our minds are the seeds of the Buddha and many fetterers of intentional formations. So you're careful with what you say because you're watering seeds of displeasure and discomfort and harm. And then number four, not exaggerating or embellishing. We don't dramatize unnecessarily or making things sound better or worse, right? So right speech is based on right thinking. Speech is a way for our thinking to express itself out loud. Our thoughts are no longer our private possessions. We give earphones to others and allow them to hear the audio tape of what's playing in our mind. So this question of can you notice what of your speech is it honest? Is it useful? Is it timely? So just putting attention towards this practice really cultivates a kindness. And I want to just point also to another part of from Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching. It says deep listening is the foundation of right speech. If we cannot listen mindfully, we cannot practice right speech. No matter what we say, it will not be mindful because we are speaking only with our own ideas and not in response to the other person. So in the Lotus Sutra, we are advised to look and listen with the eyes of compassion. Compassionate listening brings healing. And when someone listens to us this way, we feel some relief right away. A good therapist always practices deep compassionate listening. We have to learn to do the same in order to hear people we love and restore communication with them. So this idea that wise speech also includes our deep listening. I just love that that's part of the talk. Yeah. So there's a little foundation of what is wise speech. I'll turn it back over to you, Renee.
Thank you, Patrick. And I love that. That way of framing it from Thich Nhat Hanh. And I think, as I learned about this practice of wise speech, I learned, it has these components to it, which Patrick just mentioned. And I'll bring in another short quote from the Buddha on this. And the Buddha said that this wise speech, it is spoken at the right time. That's the timely piece. It is spoken in truth. It is spoken affectionately. It is spoken beneficially. It is spoken with a mind of goodwill. So all of these things are like, oh, wow, these are great things to practice with in our speech. And I think, it has been really helpful to me to think of this as a practice, as something I engage with in an ongoing way. And that feels really beneficial. And at the same time, I'm entering into this practice as a queer person, as someone who has learned about and lived queer history, our own history, and even from my own lifetime, as a young person, being around folks who were dying of AIDS, and then the activism that happened around that, particularly ACT UP, and the incredible importance of speaking in the context, particularly of the AIDS epidemic. So like one of the slogans of ACT UP was silence equals death, really bringing out the way that the urgency of speech. And I think, when I think of my own practice with wise speech, sometimes it's like, oh, I want all these elements to be here. And honestly, it's fucking hard. Can we say that? Okay, sorry. It's a lot to try to be timely, honest, kind, useful. That's a big weight on our speech. And then there's the just life, kind of life affirming, life defending piece of just speaking our truth. And sometimes, we don't have all of the resources to say it perfectly, to have all of these qualities there. And so we're kind of like a balancing both having this beautiful guidance from the Buddha about how to be in loving relationship with each other through the practice of wise speech, and at the same time knowing that sometimes we just have to speak. And I want to bring Audre Lorde in, actually, because I think she speaks to this really beautifully. She has an essay that's called "The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action." And it's in this collection that I have, this new collection of the selected works of Audre Lorde. It's also in Sister Outsider, if you have that. And she's just speaking about how hard it is to speak. And she says, and of course I am afraid, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation. And that always seems fraught with danger. But my daughter, when I told her of our topic and my difficulty with it, said, tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent, because there's always that one little piece inside you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter. And if you don't speak it out one day, it will just up and punch you in the mouth from the inside. And I just think of this quote, because I think, if I were like creating my own loving speech guidelines, one of the things that I have added into my own practice of um, loving speech or wise speech is listening to my body. What is my body telling me needs to be spoken out? And I just had was in a difficult conversation just the other day where I had some feedback I needed to give someone who I was working with, who I feel very warmly towards, but also who sometimes just takes up too much space. And I had that same feeling that Audre Lorde describes there. Her daughter describes it. It's like the words were knocking on the inside of my teeth. I really felt in my body I had to speak, and I wanted to speak as kindly and usefully and timely, and all of those things as I could, but also it was like, I have to get these words out because they really need to be spoken. Because my body is telling me this has to come out. So I think, I add that in as well. And I feel like when I can speak out of my body, what really needs to be spoken, keeping those other pieces in mind, even when it's a difficult piece of feedback I need to tell someone that might have an impact on them, when it's really coming from my own experience, my own bodily experience, I find that it's received more in the spirit of loving speech, as much as is possible. So yeah, I wanted to just like hold this paradox of wanting to speak as lovingly and wisely as possible, and also, we need to speak our truth sometimes, however it comes out. So pass back to you, Patrick.
I just love it. It's so smart, Renee. Like this, I think we can all relate to that sensation. Thank you for sharing that story. In the Dharma, there's so many places that were pointed towards practice and noble silence and silent retreats. And I think that there's a truth to the idea that when we are silent, there is a different thing possible in our practice. For anybody that's been on retreat, or even just in this mindful moment of practice we had together tonight, things arise that don't have a chance to arise when you aren't silent, when you're talking and moving and paying the bills and driving the car and picking up the kids. When we're slow and silent, something else is possible. So I don't want to take away from the noble silence and what's possible there. And yet, practicing both, and this strong history of queer folks of, stepping into our truth and stepping into our power and using our voices and our bodies to express is one of our greatest strengths. I think of the ways in which, having been told to be quiet or to be silent, like it turns into a tape that we used to run in my head, that it was out of my place if I was speaking, or I was inappropriate, or you don't speak to, if the teacher says be quiet, be quiet. And yet there were things that were really wrong that I needed to speak to, that knocking on your teeth, I pulled a book. So Renee and I were in Community Dharma Leader with Kate Johnson, and she wrote a book called Radical Friendship. And she says this really amazing stuff about being friends. And in one chapter, she's talking about telling secrets. And some of the language she uses, I think, speaks to what I was feeling like when I needed to tell the truth. So telling secrets is not just about getting something off your chest. It's also about exposing social truths that need to change. When the secrets we keep conceal our honest lived experiences, the remaining silence holds us back from liberated friendships that we seek. If we never let on how we've been harmed, and those harms have no chance of being amended. If we never admit when we've made a mistake, then our friends can't rely on us to be accountable to learn from our experiences. This last section is like, while the culture is changing and we're generally becoming more open to all subjects that used to be undiscussable, when we openly challenge existing power structures, our words are often dismissed as rude or inappropriate. Taboos and etiquette around speech, whether at home, school, or work, are often served to reinforce the status quo. And that's the part, like the discernment to to name that if this silence is only in the effort of creating etiquette, right, or that's become taboo, then how do we stand in our truth? I think of the moment where the Buddha, when Siddhartha's under the tree and touches the earth, like, whose right do you have to be queer? Whose right do you have to be flamboyant? Whose right do you have to be outside of my gender understanding in this lame ass world that doesn't understand gender? Like, whose authority? That power of ours to tap into the earth and say it's our birthright. It's our queer birthright to tell our truth and be expressive. I get really excited about it, but I think that there's space for both, understanding when and where silence is of benefit to you and your practice, and then also not to be silenced arbitrarily by antiquated and really harmful structures. Hope that's not too basic. That's what I'm feeling.
Yeah, I love that. I still haven't read Kate's book, but I'm really looking forward to it. You were complete there for the moment? Okay. Yeah, and we're kind of like having this interplay of speech and silence. And I think one of the teachers who I've been sitting with a lot and practicing with a lot is Lama Rod Owens, and he brings in silence as one of his homecomings in his 7 homecomings practice, which is sort of taking the refuges of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha and adding on 4 more of ancestors, the earth, silence, and ourselves. And so it's been another place where I've been, just as I invite in that homecoming or refuge or support of silence, feeling how much there is in silence to support our practice and to support us, and then also holding it in this, within this paradox that we also need, as Patrick was saying so beautifully, as queer folks, we need to be able to speak and express who we are and how we live and bring our critiques of the dominant culture forward unapologetically. Yeah, and then I also wanted to kind of come back around to the beginning with the quote from Thich Nhat Hanh around deep listening being part of this practice of wise speech. And as queer folks, I feel like we also are in such an intentional web of relationships. One of the things, many gifts that we bring to our culture is our practices of friendship and chosen family, and building chosen family out of our relationships of love and friendship. So this piece, is the mirror of wise speech, is deep listening. And it's such a gift that we can give each other. And so just, I want to invite that into this practice of wise speech, that the listening, just as I was speaking of, like, how do we speak up out of the body, really speaking what we hear in our own body. For one thing, that takes a deep listening of ourselves, really offering ourselves this deep listening to know when are the moments when we need to speak. And then also offering that deep listening to others. And I've been thinking a lot lately just about the power of witnessing one another. Whether it's in our healing work, in sharing our stories, there is a power in witnessing that I think for me kind of gets folded into this this practice of wise speech, loving speech, and deep listening, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it. I'm going to check in with you, Patrick. I have like one more little piece, but did you have anything else before we go to inviting you all to do some speaking and listening?
I'm complete, Renee. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to bring in one quote from one of my teachers, Larry Yang, and I think it really speaks to this just ongoing, lifelong process of loving speech and trying to be as kind as possible while also honoring our truth. So I want to end with Larry's words. This is another quote I come back to over and over again. So Larry says, this is actually in an article from Lion's Roar, and I can put the link in the chat. It's called In the Moments of Non-Awakening. And Larry says, when I do metta practice, cultivating love and compassion towards all beings in all worlds and in all directions, there is an ancillary blessing that I hold in my mind. And this is the blessing. May I be loving, open, and aware in this moment. If I cannot be loving, open, and aware in this moment, may I be kind. If I cannot be kind, may I be non-judgmental. If I cannot be non-judgmental, may I not cause harm. If I cannot not cause harm, may I cause the least harm possible. And just for me, those words just land with so much resonance in my ongoing practice of being as loving as possible in my speech, but also being as loving as and compassionate as possible with myself when I, however it comes out, and in meeting myself just where I am, even in those moments when I might say something that causes a hurt or ouch or comes out more sharply than I planned. So